Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Camille Tootie, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. The Modern Government, the Evolution of Environmental, Social, and Governance Policy, produced by GovExec and brought to you by KPMG. Changing global norms and evolving public expectations mean today's government leaders are driven to make an impact on key environmental, social, and governance policies, or ESG for short. Today, in the first part of our series, we'll explore key trends and priorities in the ESG space, benefits of a forward-thinking ESG policy, and best practices for government officials as they take action on ESG issues. Here to discuss these issues is a great panel. Glenn Elliott, who's the Director of the Environmental Program Office at the Department of Veterans Affairs, Kathleen Webb, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the California State Controller's Office. And last but not least, Corinne Doherty, partner at KPMG. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's get started. I think first, it's important to really set the stage and for what we mean by ESG and define the terms for our audience. How do each of you approach this framework and what does it mean for government? Kathleen, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think happy to start. And as far as for us in the state of California, ESG is something we already do as far as paying attention to environmental, social, and obviously governance and government matters. So I think what we did here in California is look really to our own kind of framework that we use and then be much more intentional about thinking about it. And it's still, I will tell you, we're still in our infancy stage of really being intentional about that. But when I think about what we do as public servants and being good stewards of the public good, you know, thinking about environmental protection, thinking about health and well-being through education, human capital matters, whether it's fair pay, safe working conditions, or the exploitations of humans. Those are all things that we actually focus on. It's just really thinking about it, I think, in a much more specific strategic mindset, and then thinking about the risks that we need to manage too as well.
Glenn?
Yeah, so to build on what you just said, at VA we look at it as it's the environmental cost of doing business. It's not just the environment as many think of it as, you know, earth, water, land, et cetera, but also the human environment. So we also tie that to the patient care of our veterans, the care of the environment associated with a new building, a new facility, siting those facilities. And I like you said, being more deliberate, more strategic about documenting and looking at the risks associated with those and taking those into consideration in following ESG.
Corinne, what's your perspective on the term?
Sure. Well, I mean, I agree with everything that Kathleen and Glenn have said so far. And the way we look at it at KPMG is the way we define ESG is that it's a framework that integrates the environmental, social, and governance risks, as well as the opportunities for an organization's strategy to build long-term sustainability and really focused on achieving desired outcomes for citizens and their stakeholders. And I know when Kathleen talked about it, she talked about a framework, she talked about risk as well. And so under each one of the pillars, the ES and the G, there's a number of different topics. I mean, Kathleen named a lot of them. I mean, from environmental, there's climate risk, greenhouse gas emissions, social, you know, Kathleen hit on, you know, human capital, DEI, environmental justice. And governance is really focused on, well, how does the agency hold itself accountable? And some topics under there include transparency and disclosure around ESG non-financial metrics, risk management, and cybersecurity. So kind of to sum all of that up, the way I look at it is all of these topics are not new for government. But the term ESG is new. That's coming from the private sector, and there's been a lot of focus over the last couple of years because all of these topics are not new. They're not new for government, but they're getting a really increased emphasis as to what's kind of happening within the economy here in the United States and globally. So I think one key takeaway is that, you know, ESG isn't just for the private sector. And Kathleen really kind of hit on that and did a great job explaining that. But there really is a role that government plays in all of the topics under each of the environmental, social, and governance pillars.
So let's talk about role. What role do both government and industry play in developing these ESG initiatives? Glenn?
So one of the things we were talking about the other day was our partner in the private industry. So looking at what they're doing, but also the role that we play is looking at what are we currently doing now? What is our baseline? And what are, as mentioned earlier, what are the goals that we're trying to reach? And then identifying before that the metrics to get there. What are we trying to accomplish? And then kind of scorecard it on the way there. I liked how earlier you went through each item and identified, how each one of those, it's almost like creating a matrix of how it applies to whether it's a project, whether it's new acquisition, new construction. When we're starting to look across that, what are our goals that we're going to bring in from each one of those, identifying the metrics and moving into that, but sharing with our partners. And the partners aren't just the community, it's also other regional municipalities and government, because they also are part of, when you identify the risk, they would have to bear that risk. So one of the things we're looking at is to draw down all of that risk to the environment, which consequently in most cases also draws down the risk to the overall project.
Kathleen, looking at this collaboration, if you will, where can industry and government work together? What can they learn from each other in doing so?
That's a great question, but I think, and Glenn was kind of touching upon it, I think government, whether it's at local level or state or federal level, has long been involved with public-private partnerships. We know that we have to work in collaboration with each other. I think one of the things it's really important as we move forward with this, whether it's our academia or our private sector partners, is having a shared why. And I think that shared why for all of us is about what does long-term value creation look like and resilience in kind of an ever-changing risk ecosystem. I think those are really interesting conversations that I think we all share. That's what we're trying to achieve, but we have different roles in how we achieve those things. And I think the other thing that's really important is even in government, not everybody's going to be focused on every element of ESG. For example, our Environmental Protection Agency is obviously going to be very focused on environmental things, but I think as Glenn pointed out, that environmental impact also has a bearing on the human capital and effects on human when you think about those that are under-resourced or in adverse situations. And so how do we address all that together? And I think one of the things I'm hoping out of all of this that we get to is we use these terms, return on investment and return on value, and they're kind of well-ingrained terms, but we oftentimes think of them as very separate and distinct measurements. I think we need to think about them more holistically together in that long-term value creation while we address these kind of short-term shocks that we're all dealing with, whether it's pandemic, wildfires, hurricanes, whatever it may be. I think before I forget, the other thing that I think is really important, I appreciate kind of Glenn's thought on this, I think he was hitting upon it, is we need to be involved with engaging, increasing civic participation in creating these long-term kind of solutions together. So how do we engage the people of this country and be also on this journey with us as we're going forward?
To build on that to build on that just a little bit. So when we're looking, you take a look at the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act. When you're doing an analysis of whether it's siting a new facility, expanding a new facility, or maybe acquiring additional property and expanding into that, you look at the resources associated to bringing that there. You look at a couple things. You look at where is it that we're looking at putting that? And you get into the environmental justice aspect. Is this a benefit to that community? Is it going to stress something that exists there? That's all part of NEPA. Taking a look at the utilities, taking a look at the fire, police, et cetera. Now, when we come, we have our own police force. There's some VA campuses that actually have fire stations. So you look at, now that's actually a benefit because it's a VA resource, but it's situated there in the community. But you also look at, the environmental factors associated with the property. Are you going to affect traffic, air, and those type things? So that's just touching upon that one piece of it, just to build a little bit about what Kathleen had just said.
Kathleen also mentioned that different agencies have different focus areas. So, Corinne, for agencies looking to get started on building an ESG framework, where should they begin? What steps are important to take, and what are some of the risks that they should avoid?
Sure. I think I want to answer that question, but build off of what Kathleen and Glenn were talking about and what I've seen in the private sector where governments are looking to get started, or when the private sector is really trying to figure out, well, how am I going to be successful in my ESG journey? And building on what they were saying is what I've seen in the private sector is companies that and organizations, when they bring the entire organization together around their ESG strategy, from the chief sustainability officer, the chief financial officer, internal audit, risk, chief data officers, that when all parts of the organization come together and clear on the strategy, that's where organizations can be really successful. And I think that applies here to governments. But getting back to your initial question, I mean, governments really need to be thinking about, well, what's their mission? That is pretty inherent in government as a whole. But what is their strategy around climate change? What are those key areas to focus on? Because you don't want to boil the ocean. But then it's really thinking about, well, how are you going to operationalize that strategy? So if we're talking climate risk and climate change and climate resiliency, and looking at your assets in terms of decarbonization, well, how are you going to change your operations? So it's really looking at, like, what does ESG mean for the agency, and then looking at, well, what are those risks and opportunities? Because there are a number of opportunities. For example, going back to my initial point of decarbonization, I mean, that could be switching to renewable energy could reduce cost. But I think what Glenn talked about from the NEPA standpoint is really important is, well, analyzing that stakeholder impact. Like, what is that impact to the stakeholders going to be? And then that has to be factored into the overall strategy. So I think those are some of the areas that governments can really start focusing as they're trying to figure out, well, where are they on their ESG journey if they're just starting?
Glenn, you were nodding along as Corinne was speaking. What particularly resonates with you?
Don't boil the ocean. I hear that a lot. I'd start with, we were discussing this question yesterday too, and you have to start with what are the tools and what are the information available and what are you already doing? I think we all mentioned already, we're already doing this to a point, but identifying those, then look at, like I mentioned, what is your goal? It's tied to your mission. What is your overall mission? What is your goal to enhance that? While following in with ESG. The other big thing that I think is doing a gap analysis on what you are doing now, identify what that next step is that you have to put in place or need to enhance to get to your target goal, which again, always tied to the mission. For us, it's taking care of veterans. And keeping in mind, we have a broad spectrum, benefits, healthcare, cemetery administration. So that's a pretty big picture. Taking a look at what each individual, your smaller groups, your municipalities, smaller agencies, taking a look at that and saying, what do we need to get there? And maybe breaking it apart in different sections. One of the things we talk about a lot is making it bite-sized. Just take off a little bit at a time and make those milestone steps that you need to head in that direction. But also find out what tools are available and talk to your brother and sister agencies and say, or just another, maybe it's another state, hey, what are you doing in this? Don't reinvent the wheel. That's we can throw out a lot of phrases, but that's a big one in my opinion. Find out what somebody have already done and do some modeling in comparison to that.
Well, my follow-up question is that you said talk to your brother and sister agencies. Whom are you turning to get those best practices or ideas or even inspiration?
So it depends on what we're talking about. VA is working with CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, and through that there's a huge network. But we also have our military side. We have the DoD. I work with USACE on a regular basis on a number of issues, and they're great partnerships to have those discussions with the simple question, what are you doing? And it can range from anything when you're at a seminar or a meeting, or you're on a specific target project, and it's just like, hey, yeah, I'm working on this right now. What are you guys doing for this? Because those conversations they build, and they say, oh, you know what, so-and-so is working on that. Have that conversation. You know what, the comptroller I was just talking to in California, and they just mentioned that. Why don't you have a conversation with them? Those relationships are great. To get back to it, we work a lot with CEQ, have conversations recently with HUD and FEMA.
I'd like to ask the same question for you, Kathleen.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what's really fortunate about being with the state controller is she serves on so many boards and commissions that include the pension systems here in California, our state lands commission, housing projects. Obviously, we're involved with economic discussions. So we are able to insert ourselves into a lot of those conversations with a lot of the other agencies that are involved with those activities. So there is a natural tendency to have that, but it goes back to, again, I think where Glenn and Corinne and I have been talking about it, really needs to be intentional conversations about it. And, one of the things I've been a big advocate for here in California is kind of, and it's sometimes difficult for government because I think our natural way of operating has been to be a little bit more risk adverse. And I get that from a policy making standpoint. You want to be very thoughtful. You want to mitigate risk for lots of people. But I argue that we need to be more risk intelligent as we really think about our environment. Because in the realm of risk, there's things that we want to mitigate because they could be harmful, but there's opportunities. And so one of the things I always have people really kind of think about it, piggybacking off of what Glenn was saying, is really think about what are the threats that may affect your mission, but what are the opportunities that may enhance your mission, that may help you achieve where you're going in 2022 and beyond. And so it is having those intentional, thoughtful conversations. And what I find really interesting with state work is there was this kind of aversion to even talk about risk, but we have to talk about risk. It is ever present around us, and we just need to have informed conversations and bring data into those conversations so we can make the best decisions for the people that we serve. Kathleen,
how are you seeing ESG initiatives present at your agency outside of their direct development, and how does it impact things like hiring and talent development?
That's a great question. So we're involved, obviously, as I shared, on so many policy levels. But when we think about internally our responsibility, and Glenn was actually talking about this earlier, we're even looking at reducing our office space, reducing our carbon footprint, also reducing our energy consumption. Obviously, hybrid work is a way of addressing those things. We get involved, obviously, with financial forecasting, not only for our own program area, but also for the state. Continuity of operations is really important. Cybersecurity, catastrophe planning. Those are all things that are what we need to do in managing our resources and be more proactive in managing those resources. Now, what that means for workforce is actually exciting for me. I think gone is the status quo, I think, for a lot of folks. And certainly it was accelerated with pandemic. But I think with our current workforce, as we expand our digital footprints and learn how to serve in new and different ways, is an opportunity for our current workforce to reskill and upskill. So we need to be really thoughtful about what are those new competencies and how do we help our staff actually build the capabilities and the knowledge and the skills to actually perform in different ways. And then the other exciting thing is really kind of attracting those coming out of college or even high school to public service roles. And, part of it is we have to showcase that we are innovative and we have a growth mindset here at government that would attract young people to come work for government as well.
Actually, if I could piggyback off of what Kathleen said, I mean, just from what I've seen and going on campus and talking to students, ESG is a really important topic. Climate is a really important topic. And our younger generation wants to work for organizations where they're aligned with their purpose. So Kathleen, I loved what you said about that, because if governments can kind of get out their mission and see and get out there and say, this is what we're going to do for you from a DEI standpoint or human capital working, for the government. And then how are you helping the greater good in terms of, what the mission is for the organization? We're really starting to see a shift from students coming out of college and joining the workforce and really focused on, I want to work for an organization that aligns with my purpose.
Glenn, I'm sure you can relate to that as VA, it has this great mission and people are drawn there because of the mission.
It's interesting. I've worked for Army before, and I had a colonel that says, it won't take you long, you'll figure out the mission. And he was on point with that. And shortly in coming to VA, I started working for design and construction for the cemetery administration. And very shortly, being on site on a cemetery administration property, it hits you like a lightning rod what your mission is. And what's really fun, in the last couple of years, I've served on quite a few hiring boards. And when you start talking to the people looking to come to VA, they are veterans. They had a veteran in the family, and they want to come work for something that supports that. Then you tie it to ESG. I've watched these individuals come in the door. I've worked with them as project managers, program managers, and they ask the questions about environment. They ask the questions about resiliency. They ask the questions about, and this isn't part of this is when you're having a kickoff meeting for a project. They're asking making sure they're on point with their priorities, making sure they're asking questions about, LEED certification and things like that. Those are great things to hear. And, I've been doing this for over 17 years. That's a change, and that's a great change. One thing we do with a lot of the folks that we work with is make sure there's training. The other piece of the picture is making sure those individuals understand the not just the mission, but the big picture of the process, where their cog is in that, so they can understand, okay, I do this because it affects this. But then they also have the folks who we work with are awesome. They'll sit there and go, well, if I did this, then that would enhance that project. If we got these baseline reports for environmental, we established that site information earlier, that would enhance this process. I think those are the great things that you like to hear and that you really want to, work through and identify, especially in the hiring process.
So if we talk about the policy-making process, how can ESG issues teach us about that process more broadly? And what's the role of the public servant when working with issues like this? I'll start with Kathleen.
Yeah, that's a great conversation. I was just at a session last week on kind of a newer technology emerging. But again, I think from a private sector standpoint, and I appreciate this, is, they look for their opportunity statements. I think from a government standpoint, I'm always looking at what problem are we to solve, and as stewards of the public good. What is the problem that's in front of us that's affecting our communities, and how do we come together with kind of a shared why on what that problem statement is, so then we can all align together with regards to the path forward. Because I think if you're not clear on that problem statement, you get all these kind of sub-agendas developing, and those sub-agendas could be at crosshairs with each other. But really being clear on the why and aligning everybody together with the why we're all coming together, and appreciating the roles and responsibilities we all have in moving it forward. And I always remind people, if you've got really good, clear policy, good regulations will follow, because there's a clear North Star that we're all working towards. And then the regulations provide the guardrails to actually achieve that North Star. And so I think that's really the role I see here in California, and probably anywhere else, is to good policymaking. But I also think it's important to bring stakeholders into that policy discussion, and all those that could be affected directly or indirectly.
From our standpoint, a lot of the times, federal government, an executive order comes out, and it's like, okay, how are we going to react to that? Bottom line is, what is our plan? It's directed that, there will be a plan, i.e. you will come up with a program, a procedure. And that's what we're doing right now. You look at, from an environmental standpoint, executive order, 14057. Right now we're working on a climate action plan. but that's documenting. And that gets back to our earlier discussion. What is your mission? What is your goal? So you target the goal with the climate action plan. Then you start developing the metrics that are associated with getting there. And again, that kind of leads to the, role model effect, but also sharing with others lessons learned and things like that. So it's what's working for you. And then the big key also is, and not to, leave out private sector, is what is the private sector doing? Are they working, Kathleen mentioned, new tools. What is a new tool? What is a new process? What is a new way of looking at things? What is a new technology that they're utilizing? Keeping your eyes and ears open and to those things, but also have those lines of communication established. Kathleen, I think, said, making sure the definition is right. And it's also making sure that what we're heading at, what our goal is on track is, and we don't get just down one rabbit hole. There's a ton of rabbit holes, but we're all looking to get to one place. I think helps develop a more balanced approach to getting to those goals, and teaming up with the right partners, you can get there faster.
So what does success look like for an ESG initiative? Glenn, you mentioned metrics, and what's the best way to develop and chart successful outputs, and how do you quantify them?
We're actually going through this right now. The Office of Construction and Facilities Management is standing up a sustainability office. So those metrics, some are directed by regulatory process, but I think working back from there, what are as I said before, the bite-sized pieces that you can address? Also, the communication piece, standing up working groups to make sure that you have the right players, the users, the individuals that develop standards, the engineers, the contracting officers, you mentioned, supply chain, making sure all of that information is feeding into that. I think it is and having the right people and the right groups addressing those metrics. And then I think getting buy-in on those metrics, that those are the right metrics, because you have to look back to say, okay, we years up, let's look at those metrics. And now let's look back. How did that metric really describe what we accomplished in this last year? And do we need to readjust? So not just locking in those metrics and saying, we did a plan, we did a procedure, those are the metrics, roll out. It's reassessing those over time to make sure that the metrics are addressing or describing what happened and where you wanted to go, pluses and minuses. And then developing that next year's metric or that next milestone's metrics, I think that's key.
Corinne?
Yeah, I was going to say, I completely agree with everything Glenn said. That's a lot of what I was going to say as well. But one thing I'll say is, I think this is an area where the government can look to the private sector, because the private sector has been reporting on different ESG metrics based on the different standards that are out there. So there's climate metrics, there's human capital metrics, there's governance metrics. So I think what Glenn was talking about is really important is, well, what's the mission? What are the areas we're going to focus on? And then determining, well, what is the desired outcome? What are the programs that we're going to put into place? And then how are we going to track that? That's going to, like what Glenn was saying, that's going to determine what those metrics are. And I think, and I'm going to double down, Glenn, on what you said, is by looking at it over time. That is really important in terms of reporting on, the outcome of what those metrics are, but looking at it year over year to say, okay, this program that we put in place or this new policy, or how has that been performing, and do we need to tweak? Being the accountant in the room, one of the sayings we always say is, what gets measured gets managed. So I think it's important to figure out, well, what are those metrics we're going to report on, and then disclose what those metrics are. And so that way the decision makers can go look over the time and saying, well, is this working? Do we need to tweak certain metrics or disclosures?
Kathleen, same question for you. How do you know an ESG effort has been successful?
That's a really good question, Camille. And I think what I would also want to add first is, just like good strategic planning is a process, I think ESG is a process. And I think we need to intentionally integrate into our planning processes. I would be concerned about kind of saying, it's an outcome and we've arrived there. I think we're going to be always looking at environmental, social, and government matters, and we just need to be more intentional in that process of looking at it and maturing where we're going or responding to new, risks within our ecosystem. But I think for me, success at a statewide level is understanding that we're baking this in consciously into our strategic planning measures in support of our missions. But I think the other piece for me is the people side of it is we can bake this in and kind of drive our organizational and operational models, but there also has to be a cultural shift. And so that's the people side of it. And so how do we actually really move forward both in our goals and our values as organizations so that we are really making this cultural shift and changing behavior? Because I think right down at an organizational level, but right down to the individual level, this is also requiring all of us to change behaviors so we can be good stewards of this planet that we live on and create kind of a more resilient environment for us to continue on.
So how do you mentioned something interesting before, Kathleen. You said that terms might change, and we've brought up resilience. How do you adapt to that when terminology changes or, the evolution of the terminology happens?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I think Glenn has talked about it too. I think you need to probably go back and visit and make sure you have a shared agreement, because if you don't have shared agreement, you can have people going off in different directions addressing something. So, I think as we all evolve and as we learn more about certain circumstances and maybe a definition becomes a little bit broader than initially it was, we just need to come together and make sure we are clear about what we're using that term to define, what it means for all of us. So there's a shared vocabulary and a shared language. And I think when we don't have that shared vocabulary and shared language, there is problems. So there's just this constant revisiting, which gets back into, I think, ESG is a process. And we're going to continue to be at it and learning from each other and learning as the years go by.
Glenn, did you want to add to that?
It's an iterative process. The definitions change, the targets change. But also, technology changes. Improvements in technology can, there could be something that could show up tomorrow in technology-wise, we'd all hope for, that fixes, when we're looking at, carbon net zero. And it's those things. So you have to have that iterative process looking at what is the next goal then? Okay, we fixed that one. Let's move on to the next one. Continuously improving. Looking at the technology and the tools that you have available to you.
Corinne, from your perspective and KPMG's perspective, what do you think lies ahead for ESG initiatives across government? And what do you hope to see?
Yeah, as ESG evolves, governments now have the opportunity to build on a foundation of leadership, and with this observable shift in the way that governments have typically led on ESG issues. I think we've talked a lot, and Kathleen did a great job talking about, the ESG process. But one of the things that I would like to see is what we kind of talked about the next generation, is that ESG agendas really can help attract the next generation in the workforce that's really connected to their purpose and their mission, which will then help to accelerate the government's efforts to modernize across their stakeholder groups to help drive innovation and lastly, improve public trust in government.
What should agencies do to kind of tweak their, when they're recruiting and retaining talent and trying to get this next generation into the government? Like, what are some of the things that they need to be changing or improving upon?
Well, not working for the government, I guess what I would say is just terms of, going on to campus and talking about the mission, because I think a lot of times in schools, maybe government may not go to career fairs, but actually educating the students on, the mission for the state of California, what Kathleen and her team is working on, and Glenn talking about veteran affairs, because students may not be aware of all of the different facets of government and the different areas that they can focus on, but tying it back to the mission. Like I said earlier, students and the younger generation, they know actually a lot more than I did at that, when I was at that age, about understanding climate change. And so I think it's just getting out and talking about the mission and showing the importance of the mission versus, changing anything within the organization.
Glenn?
Yeah, to definitely build off what Corinne just said, we do a lot of public meetings, new construction projects. Through the NEPA process, we have, public meetings, public informational sessions, public hearings. I think that's a great opportunity, not just to describe what your project is, but it's describing why you're doing it. What is you have the purpose and need statement, making sure they understand that, especially, cemetery development, why you're doing it, why you're expanding, why you're putting a new cemetery in, why you're moving a new hospital, why you're building a new hospital, clinics, providing that care, helping those individuals that aren't tied to veterans potentially directly understand that, but then making that tie to veterans and veterans families, what you're trying to do, bringing that care to a certain location. On top of that, though, you're mentioning about the schooling and things like that. We belong to a number of different affiliations that promote the development of veteran healthcare, et cetera. Having our relationships with our VSOs is a big part of that. But I take to heart to say what you're saying is go to the college fairs, go to those things, have those conversations. I think that's something I'm going to take back and share with some of our folks. I know that there is interaction at that level, but maybe finding out a little bit more of what is our office doing.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the original question before I ask the follow-up, what do you think lies ahead for ESG initiatives across government? Like what are you looking to do and move forward?
From my standpoint, there's been some really great, we talked heavily about environmental and resiliency. There's a recent tool that was released by CEQ and ESRI about the resiliency tool. I think that's a great first step in a direction of helping not just the federal government, but private sector agencies and stuff like that. Everybody can use it. So it's having that access to the assessment tools that help get us there. From there, those tie to the metrics that we're building. I think one thing that would be great to see is a clearinghouse or some way that we could make that communication level a little bit easier. What are the other states doing? What are the other federal agencies doing? That clearinghouse of that information in one location to be able to go and take a look at. I think that would be a great next tool to be able to take a look at and have it, transparent, open to the public. Because one thing I've learned in my career is there's something that you missed always. And there's something that somebody will pick up on and say, hey, well, what about looking at it this way? That transparency and that clearinghouse would really help, add to the horsepower of the process.
Kathleen, do you have a wish list for your own ESG initiatives going forward, or anything that you've seen that you would like to bring up?
Yeah, I think in California, I'm really excited. The governor has been really supportive, as well as the legislature, in moving forward. In fact, because of our economic situation in this last fiscal cycle, we were able to invest $308 billion over 5 years into ESG efforts. So I am excited about that, and there is a real effort. So they range from improving healthcare access to clean energy to water resilience. As probably people are following, we have some real serious drought issues here in California. So water resilience is important, fighting wildfires. Clean transit's always been an important effort for us here, affordable housing. Homelessness, obviously, as for many states, it's a huge issue, investing in all those things. And clearly, safer communities is really important. And then, obviously, education, so investment in there. So I think we're moving, and I'm really excited about where we're moving, and I look forward to kind of seeing the data come out with regards to the progress we're making on those things. So we're committed. I mean, it's something California has been committed to for a number of years, but certainly I think in a more intentional way, and really, I would say going beyond just talking the talk as we're walking the walk as well. And that's something I want to go back to, kind of your conversation about attracting new talent. And I agree with everything Glenn and Corinne said. I would just add, young people have a way to also, through internet, be able to actually get information that I think even in my early years after college, I did not have access to. But I think we also need to be thoughtful of what we're sharing with them, but also demonstrating that we are doing, in fact, what we're talking about. And I think whether it's your strategic plan calls out specific things, whether you have a dashboard that showcases what you're doing online and sharing that in a very transparent way. One of the things I talk about is how are we moving and becoming what I consider a values-based, results-driven organization. And I think that's really important to what Corinne was saying, really important to the younger generation, and I applaud that. Whether it's, in the private sector they refer to as good corporate citizenship. I think for the state, it's about stewards of the public good. But again, how are we really becoming that values-based, results-driven organization that the people need us to be?
And before we wrap up today, I have a quick do's and don'ts. Corinne, do's and don'ts for governments who want to have a solid ESG strategy or framework in place.
I would say the do is what we've talked about before is bringing all the organizations together to talk and have that. I think Kathleen said the align on the why, if I can use the way Kathleen said that. I think that is incredibly important to be successful as governments in terms of an ESG strategy. And I would say don't just do business as usual. In order to be successful and to make progress on the mission of the organization and build in ESG into the organization, you have to have a different mindset. Government has to have a different mindset, whether it's what Glenn was talking about, what are the new tools out there, what's the new design, and how can we be innovative to really take the government's mission forward around those ESG topics.
Kathleen, you mentioned, or you said earlier, there is no status quo, like that's not acceptable anymore. So would that be part of your do's and don'ts? Like don't, break out of a status quo.
Yeah, I think on the do, kind of echoing what Corinne was saying is, integrate ESG into your processes. So that's what you need to do. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not a one-time outcome. I think it's a part of doing business as we go forward. And so you need to intentionally bake it in and start educating everybody around you. And I think the don't turn this into a checklist. We are famous for creating checklists and check the box. That is not what this is about, because I think it will be ever evolving and ever changing, and will have to be baked into our processes on how do we, what's the next step in fulfilling our mission in an ever changing environment.
Glenn, no checklist.
No checklist. Don't pencil whip. Working a lot with the environmental. You've seen over history that, we did that and check the box. Looking at it, making sure you understand it, making sure your partners understand it. And for me, the do would be track your successes. But don't just track them in, I did this, I checked the box, I made the metric. But track it in a way that your partners can understand that. Create buy-in. We did this and accomplished this, whether it be lower cost to construct, whether it be a better locality that, reduce time to driving. All of those little things that you can do to enforce the need for ESG initiatives. That's my do. My don't would be don't be siloed. Have your ears, eyes open. You have partners. You have, like I mentioned before, sister and brother agencies. And when I say that, it just doesn't, the federal government, all the federal government works in a state somewhere, and they're your partners too. Having the conversations with them. What are your initiatives? What are you working on? Because the locality there has characteristics that may enhance your project or your overall mission and goal for that area. California is a big state.
Great insight. Thank you, Glenn, Kathleen, Corinne, for being here, and to our audience. Thanks so much for tuning in. Special thanks to KPMG for helping us make conversations like this possible. And we'll be back with more coverage in this area soon. I'm Camille Tutti. Have a great day. See you next time.